What I'm about to share this morning could not be shared much before this. When the events first took place, I gave an initial report years ago, but only now could I give the full story and reveal why something that I've only told one or two people. It is Sunday, December 4th. Today, this morning, in the city of Santiago, Cuba, the ashes of the world's longest ruling non-royal leader, Fidel Castro, are being laid to rest, or were just laid to rest right now. Fidel Castro was born August 13th, 1926, the illegitimate son of a wealthy landowner. He was not given his father's name until much later, nor was he baptized until he was 8 years old. He was sent away from his home to live with a teacher early on. He went to a Jesuit-run school. In college, he became immersed in student protests, studied law. He married in 1948, spent 3 months honeymooning in New York City. He began to be influenced by Marxist writings. He completed his law degree in 1950, went into business, but pretty much failed. He then ran for political office in Cuba in the Orthodox Party in the elections of 1952. But when General Batista took over the government, the elections were canceled. Batista was actually a friend of the family of Castro's wife. He gave them $1,000 to Castro and his wife for their wedding. But now Castro saw Batista as a dictator and planned to overthrow him. He launched an attack on a military barracks that failed. He was put on trial and imprisoned, sentenced to 15 years in prison. In prison, he and his wife divorced. He would then have several children with several different women. In 1954, Batista believed it would be good publicity to issue a pardon, so Castro was pardoned and released. He went to Mexico, where he met a young Argentinian, or actually a medical student, and also from Guatemala, named Che Guevara. Guevara bolstered Castro's embrace of communism. In 1956, Castro returned to Cuba with a little over 80 men on a boat to overthrow Batista. They were immediately engaged in battle. Only 19 of them made it to their destination. Castro and the survivors encamped in the mountains of Cuba. Gradually, they gained support of the people of the region, and their forces grew. Meanwhile, there were more protests and uprisings against Batista. Batista's Cuba was largely a dictatorship, corrupt, violent, filled with gambling, prostitution, the mafia. It was known as America's playground. Batista's violent responses turned more of the country against him, and more looked to Castro and his guerrillas in the east. Castro's army began moving across the island from the east to Havana. On December 31st, 1958, Batista fled the island. At the dawn of 1959, Castro entered Havana and was greeted as a hero. He was even greeted as a hero when he visited America afterwards, with many seeing him as a liberator in America and believing he'd bring democracy to Cuba. Castro denied he was a communist. He promised democracy and that he would soon bring about free elections to Cuba. None of it was true. He had long before become a disciple of communism. The elections would never come, nor would democracy. He began working with other communists to turn Cuba into a socialist state. He also began executions, first the followers of Batista, then his own allies who didn't agree with imposing communism on Cuba, then just those who didn't agree with him. He had mass executions performed in stadiums with adoring Cubans screaming for blood. He took away all private land, much of private bank accounts. He banned religious schools and institutions, and he took their property. He turned to the Soviet Union, then took over American companies, nationalizing them. President Eisenhower imposed an embargo. The Kennedy administration launched an invasion to overthrow Castro, very small and ill-planned, called the Bay of Pigs invasion, which failed. Castro then agreed to put Soviet nuclear missiles on the island aimed at America. The missiles were discovered by American intelligence. The showdown between America and the Soviet Union brought the world to the edge of nuclear destruction. In some of your lifetimes, Castro encouraged the Soviet Premier Khrushchev that if he had to launch a first nuclear strike on America. Khrushchev thought Castro was crazy, worked out a deal with Kennedy. Castro was praised for establishing near universal literacy and healthcare in Cuba, which he did. At the same time, he turned the island into a prison, ended any form of democracy, suppressed free speech, destroyed the Cuban economy. He set up watchers virtually on every block to report any activities if there was any anti-government action or word. And for that, one could be sent into prison, tortured, and killed. And there were those who died shouting, "Viva Cristo, long live Christ," in his prisons. In prison, he sent Cuban missiles around the world, actually Cuban soldiers around the world. He sent to fight communist regimes around the world until the Cuban economy was so devastated, he pulled back. He attacked and sank ships of Cubans trying to escape. In the late 1980s, communism began to collapse around the world. Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union. Castro was left alone. Cuba lost its major military and ideological ally, an economic ally, the Soviet Union, from propping it up economically, which weakened him. Then age began to mellow him. In the 1990s, he began to allow tourism and American dollars to help the economy prop it up that was nearly collapsing. He changed Cuba's designation as an atheist state to a secular state. In 1998, he allowed Pope John Paul II to come to the island, which only came on the condition that Castro would decriminalize the celebration of Christmas, which he did. After that, the Christians, evangelicals of Cuba, petitioned him, born again, to allow freedom for evangelicals. And that brings us to the story I'm about to share. Today, as Castro's ashes are being laid, I can share the entire story and things I have not shared before to complete what I did share. The real story of history is his story. Behind history is the hand of God. Above history is the sovereignty of God. At times, he gives us glimpses of his sovereignty over history. The story I'm going to tell you has never fully been told. It concerns the hand of God behind world events. Begins in the year 1999. It was that year I was asked to come over to a house in New Jersey for a secret meeting. There I met a man from Cuba who said Fidel Castro has agreed to open up the island for 1 month for an evangelical celebration. The first time since the revolution, to show the world that he had allowed religious freedom. And the man, the Cuban minister, spoke of an evil king of Israel who at the end of his life did good. He said, we want you to come over and open it up with the sounding of the shofar. I prayed and said yes. It's called the Evangelical Celebration of Cuba, the first such public gathering in the squares of Cuba since Castro took over. It was to begin in the east of the island and then move westward to culminate in Revolutionary Square. In many ways, it was paralleling the march of Fidel Castro and his movement from the east to westward to the revolution, which he just came in reverse when they now took him from Havana, his remains, to the east where the revolution began.
To find out how you can receive more of Jonathan's teachings, to receive special free gifts, or get in touch, go to hopeoftheworld.org or call toll-free 1-800-YESHUA-1. That's hopeoftheworld.org or call 1-800-YESHUA-1. That's 1-800-937-4821. You can also get more at Jonathan Cahn's Facebook page or write us direct at Hope of the World, Box 1111, Lodi, New Jersey 07644, USA. Hope of the World is dedicated to the goal of spreading God's Word and salvation to every land and people. We do this by spreading the Word throughout the world and sponsoring compassion projects to the most poor and needy around the earth. To get in touch or have a part in God's work, just write to Hope of the World, Box 1111, Lodi, New Jersey 07644, USA. Or go to hopeoftheworld.org or call 1-800-YESHUA-1. That's 1-800-937-4821.